Hello, everyone, and welcome to day two, end of day two, very end of day two for Network Field Day 29. It's a little bit later than I normally put these together, not going to lie, but I still want to try and get this out today, so we'll go ahead and power through. I'll still go ahead and split into three videos like I did yesterday and just kind of keep that format going along. So today started with Juniper, and I actually thought we were going to be getting a broader update on Juniper, and that's mostly because that's what happened at Network Field Day 28 with Juniper, but that wasn't the case. So it was 2.5 hours, all Apstra, and I'm not going to rehash everything from Apstra. You could go back and look at my video from Network Field Day 28 and get a good idea of sort of the base of Apstra, just the fiber, sorry, not the fiber, but the fabric bit of Apstra, which there was just a brief touch on some of that today, just how you can still put those fabrics together, and they got a nice little clicky GUI where you can drag and drop things. It's pretty nice, but the real focus was something called Freeform, which is relatively new to Apstra, and that is more of the automation and scripting platform that they've put together that gets more in depth configuring at large. And there's there's always this problem. It's never going to go away, and it was brought up during the session in terms of brownfield integration, or you can just bringing brownfield in, and they tried to give a good answer on it. And I think there's a bit of a mismatch. There's some disparity in there that no one's ever going to have a good, like, here's the button to bring in brownfields, because it's just, I don't know. I don't know if anybody ever gets brownfield integration to be good. So the way that you would bring things into this automation platform, if they weren't, if it wasn't greenfield, is you can basically import the config, and it will try. Freeform will try to match up some of that configuration and pair it with a template, or turn it into a template for that device. And it seemed to sort of work, and they didn't get too deep into it. And really, they just kind of brought us back to one other slide where they showed how a configuration can turn into a template, or vice versa. And they said, well, this process will work for that as well. But there's no easy import. And I think that's okay. Again, I don't know that anyone's ever going to get a brownfield import into an environment, but the lab that they put together was really impressive. And essentially, what they did was they built out the London Tube system, the subway system there, and mapped all 310 devices, 310 stations to 310 virtual Junos, or virtual. I don't know if they were routers, or if they were switches. I don't recall exactly, but they were 310 virtual Juniper devices that connected in through all of this, which, just based on that, and granted that has nothing to do with Apstra, I was very impressed with that. Just to have 310 devices run up virtually, connected all in this one infrastructure, that alone I was impressed by. I don't know what they were using under the hood. I asked about, if these were real devices or not, but I should have asked them, how they put that together. I don't know if that was, GNS or Eve, or if they had done something proprietary, or just something more. I don't know if there's a Docker version. They could, pull it out with the Docker versions as well. But that on its own, I thought that was pretty cool. So the demo that they did get into was a bit unrealistic, because essentially the presenter had picked a station, which in that demo was a router or a switch, And they said, we're going to ping this other device by name, and it didn't work. And rather than push a DNS server configuration to all of the switches, they essentially pushed a giant static mapping of all of the devices to the corresponding IP addresses. So I guess maybe that was just done to show that it could be done, that you could take this big bit of code and just jam it out there. I could have achieved the same thing just by pushing DNS servers, but they pushed it out there and showed us exactly what the code was, and it was the mapping for the 310 devices. And they clicked the button, and it just went. And it went fast. I mean, it was maybe 10 seconds, and they pushed this config throughout the entire network. It was cool. It worked. We also had started a conversation around how can you be more selective in those pushes. So if you only wanted to push to these 10 devices, or you only want this sort of code to push to routers and not switches, or firewalls and not routers. And there wasn't a good way to natively do that. Now, you could build it into a script. So you could say, hey, script, if device contains host name or a certain subset of a string within the host name, only launch this script on those devices. It kind of works, but it still appeared that freeform would still have to run that script, or at least process the logic in that script on every device. There might be a better way, but we definitely didn't get into it. It just seemed like you need to have that logic in the script, which, I mean, if you think about it, if you're going to adopt that platform and it's something that you're going to use pretty regularly, having to code that logic in the script might not be terribly cumbersome, because it's not as if it was impossible. It just wasn't as easy as saying, hey, only run this logic, or only process these script on these type devices. So there's a way through it. It's probably not the most intuitive, but you can at least do it. Something else that we got into with the configs, and this conversation got kicked around at various different points, was, so if Freeform is an automation platform, how do you make sure basically that you don't cut your legs out from underneath you? Or how do you make sure that you don't disconnect yourself from the control plane or the management plane? And that was an interesting conversation, because if you're, we kept going back to the "with great power comes great responsibility" quote from Spider-Man, and depending on which universe will depend on which of Spider-Man's aunt or uncle who had said it. The message that the Juniper team loosely kept leaning into was, don't do that. Which, it's hard. Like, it might be hard to swallow that message, that pill. But I think that's the right message ultimately, because I don't think it's fair that we consider that their platform, or want that their platform to have the ability to understand the intent between, or the outcome from all of the changes. And maybe I'm not thinking about it in depth, but it just, to me, it seems to be too much to ask from a system to say, hey, make sure this change that I'm making across all of these devices isn't disruptive. Because how could they know that? And I mean, maybe there's certain things that you can say, oh, don't remove the last IP on a device, or don't let me remove a management IP, or don't let me take the last route out of a device. But as administrators, I think we have to be the ones that keep an eye on that stuff, because again, I just don't think it's fair for the system to say, oh, this is going to be disruptive, because that's very intent based configuration, and I don't know. I don't think a system can really track that very well. Uh, and then something interesting came out of the conversation where, if you're familiar with Cisco ACI, and if you do go back and watch that original Apstra video I made from Field Day 28, the comparison that I made between it at that point in time and ACI was very apt, because that's what they did. They came up with an easier way to build a fabric that was cross vendor or vendor neutral. And something that they said with the whole configuration part, how do I make sure that I don't blow myself out of these switches or disconnect myself, was even if you do cut the in-band communication, so you break routing or you remove the last IP or whatever, you can still connect to it through out-of-band, which sort of took everyone in the room by surprise. And I think that had a lot to do with the demo that they put together, which was the subway, the tube system in London. And we're like, wait a minute, how are you going to have out of band to all of those stations? And then that's when it sort of came back together that this was still Apstra, and Freeform might be a good automation engine. Hell, it might be a great automation engine, but there are still the things that bind its operation within a fabric context, because it still is a fabric, even though they architected it that way, and it was cool and it was fanciful, and it was, again, 310 devices, real rapid. That was awesome. The use case, though, was a bit far-fetched, because when it would do the configuration, when Apstra, when Freeform would push that configuration, it was still pushing it through the out-of-band connection, which is the exact same way that ACI works. You don't configure it in band, because when you put it in, the switches are blank. There's nothing on them, but you still need to configure it, and that is done through the out-of-band. So that kind of spun the conversation a bit differently, and then we started talking about Open Gear a bit, because we had seen Open Gear yesterday or the day before, and again, the demo was cool, but that kind of ended up being the answer is, and I mean, it kind of took us hitting on it for a while before that came out, but that is the reality of a fabric like that, of Apstra, of ACI. Honestly, I know Arista has some fabric type stuff like that. I'm not very familiar with Arista's data center stuff. I believe Juniper. I'm already talking about Juniper. Again, I don't know. It was a good demo. The freeform seems to be very helpful, but there was some weirdness in the demo because of that after we got it out there, it made more sense. But I'm sorry, going forward past that, then we got into Time Voyager, and this is probably how we got into a bit of that hey, what happens if I break the configuration, is the ability to roll things back. And similarly to how the pushes were very broad, the rollbacks are very broad as well. So it's hard to be granular in rollbacks. You can do some manual reconciliation if you need to roll back. And they said it was if you're familiar with Git type operations, there are ways to roll it back more granularly. So you can do it. Again, not totally great, and I'm hoping they continue to refine this, because everything that we saw was ultimately really nice. And the last thing that I'll bring up on it was the internal monitoring. And it was nice. Like just within the system, they collect a lot of data. It's actually really similar to ACI in that regard. Is that just everything through all of the fabric devices are flowing back into the portal, or to the configuration head end, front ends, and what we saw there at the end, and again, this is very similar to ACI as well. Now that I'm thinking back to it, and maybe this is just kind of inherent in the way that fabrics work, is that you still need to alert on the data somehow. And that was a struggle in ACI as well, that you needed specific monitoring platforms that were ACI aware, I think is the way that Logic Monitor worded it. And it seems like that still exists within Apstra as well. So when you're in the platform, it's amazingly robust, and the amount of data that's flowing through it is phenomenal. But you still will likely need to launch some other tooling for alerting and monitoring outside of it. And I would say that it's probably no worse than ACI in those regards. And if you're dealing with one of those systems, or you're bringing one of those in, you're going to struggle with that no matter what. There's no perfect solution. But overall, I was definitely impressed with Freeform. It seems like it's a good way to control those pushes, to script them, to make mass changes. And I would definitely say, counter to ACI, or just in comparison to ACI, Freeform has a leg up here. It absolutely does a better job. So even when we talk about what didn't work great, or what I didn't like too much, or just whatever my critiques may be, I think that's the important message there, is these are more critiques than they are harsh criticisms, because there is no perfect system out there. And going back to the whole configuration, making sure that they don't break it, there's no perfect solution in there, but being better is better. And from what I saw today, this appears to be better. So that was Juniper. Again, I think that was like 2.5 hours. It was really nice to just spend it on this one product. And I can definitely say that within that session, I didn't get bored. I wasn't looking for it to end. It was all very relevant, great conversation from front to back. So that would be one that, if you're even just a little bit interested in, I'd go back and watch that one once that session is made publicly available, because it was ultimately really good. So that wraps up my Juniper conversation. I've got 2 more that I'm going to go ahead and put out there for Catchpoint and Kentech, both observability companies. That was fun to see observability from 2 different vantage points. So I'll go ahead and start cracking on those videos. I'll talk to you later.